Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on the RFA-1LC submission options available to our external partners. I'm Allie Price with Branding and Stakeholder Engagement, and I'm your facilitator for today's session. I'm thrilled to have you join us for this interactive discussion on a topic that I know is of interest to many. Now let's get started with a quick walkthrough of the agenda for today. We'll begin with introducing our presenters and their roles within the project. Then we'll provide an overview of RFA-1LC electronic submissions. The next portion will speak to the modernization and evolution of these forms into online e-forms, focusing on the RFA-1LC redesign. This leads us to a technical overview related to API and sFTP, e-form requirements, and some draft XML submission examples, including XML and XSD files. Prior to concluding the presentation, we'll ensure we discuss the next steps and what to expect regarding this project. Today you will hear from several project leads representing different areas of the team. Presenting today are Tim Purcell, Chief Innovation Officer and Onboard Program Director, Sarah Leonard and Samantha McBee, Business Systems Analysts, Mike Hunter, Workers' Compensation Program Manager, Pasha Sheikh Naeem, Solutions Architect from our IT team, and Praveen Kurian, Technical Lead, also from our IT team. So I'll now pass it over to Tim Purcell to get things started with an overview of the electronic submission process via Onboard. Tim?
Thank you, Allie, and hello to everybody, and thank you for joining today. As Allie said, I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at the board. We work obviously very closely with our ITS partners to develop all of our systems. And if you've been paying attention to what we've been doing over the past few years, you've probably heard of our Onboard program. And really the pillar or foundational piece of the Onboard program is moving away from paper forms and replacing those paper forms with electronic channels. One being web applications where a human being can sit down and place submissions through a wizard-based, completely claims integrated system. What we'll talk about today is the RFA-1LC and how the first option for folks to submit that will be through eCase. After you retrieve a case, you'd have the ability to submit the RFA-1LC for that case, and we're going to talk about that throughout the journey today. But as we also replace these paper forms, we want to offer automated techniques for communicating with the board to submit these forms. That being the REST API, where you can submit a client-to-client type connection and provide an API. We'll provide the API where you can actually submit the form. Also, for folks that are interested perhaps in batching these things up at the end of the day and submitting multiple RFA-1LCs, we're going to have a sFTP process whereby you can register to get an account on our sFTP server and submit multiple transactions in XML format. What you'll hear from the folks today on this call is some of the high-level technical specifications for how this will all work. Essentially what we're doing is developing a standard electronic data specification, I'll call it, for not just the RFA-1LC, but we're going to incrementally build and scale this out over time to address many of our core forms that basically facilitate the claim workflow process, whether it be from the injured worker's attorney, whether it be from a payer, etc. This is the platform that we are building. We're going to make sure it's scalable, and you'll hear from some other folks today that talk about our documentation that we'll be producing that will allow folks to see what the data requirements are. Which option that you choose, whether it be just using our web application from within eCase, where you submit these things just one by one, or whether you take advantage of the API or the sFTP, really depends on your clients, really depends on their workflow and how you want to leverage the technology. Just to summarize before I turn it over to Sarah, kind of the things I've talked about here, certainly what we're doing here really just brings about greater efficiencies, far greater efficiencies than what we get today with paper. Many times with the paper forms that we get today, the scanning is of poor quality, or there's a lot of other boxes being checked. There's really limited ways that we can drive workflow to move that claim along. For the e-form that we're going to be developing, certainly the user interface and the user experience is something that we're placing a lot of importance on, making things more intuitive. And you'll hear today that as you're submitting these e-forms, you'll have the ability to reference documents already in the case folder. So the days of having to upload supporting documentation that are already in the case folder. I mean, of course, we don't want duplicates in the case folder. So you'll have abilities to do that where drop downs and pop-ups will appear whereby you can reference a document already in the case folder. Or if it's something new, you can upload that as well. Similar to eCase upload that's in eCase today, whereby if a hearing is set and you're uploading evidence perhaps before that hearing, this will also support real-time uploads to the case file, not just for hearing set, but for other types of statuses as well. And of course, at the end of the day, we're really doing this to fulfill our mission, which is really serving the injured worker and the employers out there to ensure that we are moving the case process along. And all of this really is predicated on the subject number that we released on November 2nd, whereby our executive team mandates that we are moving to electronic submittals for the RFA-1LC. We're targeting this to take place toward the end of this year. We'll have more information and we'll probably, talk about that with some of your questions today in terms of what our timeline looks like. But if you haven't had a chance to look at the subject number, please do. And of course, we'll be around both during this and after this for any of your questions that you may have. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, and she's going to kind of walk you through what we've done with the RFA-1LC.
Thanks, Tim. I'm Sarah Leonard, and I'll be talking about the redesign in the next few slides. So you'll notice on this slide, we have the 3 categories similar to today's paper RFA-1LC. And under each category, the request reasons will still display. So we have the 3 categories, and you'll notice there's more request reasons today, or more request reasons on the redesign than there is today. The request reasons have been revamped for clarity and to obtain more details to ensure efficient processing. And users will access the RFA-1LC e-form through the eCase application. Based on the request reasons selected, the web application will present questions for the user to answer. There are a few additional sections that need completion, such as supporting documentation and certification. Once all the questions and sections have been completed, the user will submit the form. And upon submission, the system automatically generates a PDF and places it in the case folder. The user will be able to view, print, or download the PDF from the eForms landing page, and it can also be viewed through eCase. Here's an example of what the user will complete for the reason claimant is not working and not receiving payments. So they'll enter the payment, or they'll select the payment reason, whether they were suspended and should be reinstated, or payments have not been made to date. They'll need to complete the begin and end dates and the degree of disability, and they'll be asked if continuing payments is requested or an expedited 45-day hearing is needed. So now I'm going to turn it over to Pasha to discuss the REST API and sFTP processes.
Thanks, Sarah. This is Pasha Sheikh Naeem. I'm going to cover the technical overview. As Tim mentioned before, apart from web app, clients can submit RFA-1LC form electronically using eForms REST API and sFTP process. Let me go over eForms REST API now. So eForms REST API can be used to submit forms electronically from client applications. To access eForms API, clients need to subscribe the API by registering with WCB's Akana API gateway. During the registration, Akana will provide client ID and secret to generate access token. To submit RFA-1LC form, client applications need to pass the access token and form data to the form submission API. The API stores the XML data in database and generates a submission ID, which can be used for future references. After this, API calls a background process to process the XML data. The background process first validates the schema and business rules to accept or reject the transactions. If there are any errors, then the transaction is marked as rejected. If everything is fine, then background process marks the transaction as accepted. A PDF is generated and placed in the case folder. In both the cases, background process generates an acknowledgement. For rejected transactions, the acknowledgement contains status as rejected and reason for rejection. For accepted transactions, acknowledgement contains status as accepted and the PDF that is generated in the above process as base64 string and includes in the acknowledgement. And the acknowledgement is sent back to the client application using SignalR notification API. Yeah, this slide is the same thing what I explained in the REST API process. Please use it as reference when you get the presentation. So now I'm going to talk about the sFTP process. Clients can use sFTP process to submit forms in bulk. Clients can upload XML files with multiple form submission transactions to WCB's sFTP location. To upload files as sFTP location, first clients need to register with WCB to get access to the sFTP location. Once the access is granted, clients can upload the files. When a file is uploaded, the Watcher application picks up the file, extracts all the form submissions, and processes each submission XML data in the file. The processing of each form submission is same as REST API process that I explained before. The background process performs schema validation and business rules validation to accept or reject transaction. If all the validations are passed, the transaction is marked as accepted. A PDF report is generated and stored in the case folder. If there are errors, the transaction is marked as rejected. Again, the process generates an acknowledgement for both accepted and rejected transactions. In case of rejected transaction, acknowledgement contains rejected status and reason for rejection. For accepted transaction, acknowledgement contains accepted status and PDF report. Unlike REST API, the acknowledgement is written to an acknowledgement file, and this process repeats for each form submission in the XML file. Once all form submissions are processed, the acknowledgement file will be placed in the same sFTP location for clients to pick up later and process. Since we are picking the file immediately, the processing of the XML file is going to be near real time. Some cases it may be a little bit more, depending on the number of transactions in the file. That's about for sFTP process. And again, this slide is explaining the details. Please use it as reference when you get the presentation. Okay, so next, my country is going to talk about eForms data requirements. What do you want?
Thank you, Pasha. So as was just asked a little while ago, the board is creating a requirement spreadsheet, which you'll see a screenshot on your screen with various tabs on the bottom. This spreadsheet was created to easily identify what's needed in those API and XML submissions. It's going to be very important to review the spreadsheet when determining what's submitted and when. And this spreadsheet, again, going to be key for successful transmission of those API and XML submissions. Help you to upfront reduce those errors and rejected data so you can send clean data through the first time around. Go over a few of the tabs on the spreadsheet just to give you a couple examples of what you'll find on there when the spreadsheet is shared. First tab is instructions, just high-level instructions on how to actually review that spreadsheet. Change log, going to be a very important tab in there. We use the same thing in our claims standard that we currently have here at the board. This is used to document any changes to the requirements. So for example, if we post this spreadsheet on March 1st, we don't want to blindly then post changes on May 1st. Any change we make after that first spreadsheet is posted will always be added to that change log, so you can easily identify where and when we change something in our requirements. Element rules, that's going to lay out the data rules for each of those fields, as well as some of the error text that will return if a rule is not met. To use an example, WCB case ID rule, that's set to make sure that the field is in the format of a WCB case number. Today, we have very limited format. It's 8 characters. It can begin with only certain letters. So if you were to send all Z's for the WCB case ID, we would reject that as not being in a valid format. The schema elements and element requirement conditions tabs, each of these tabs are going to list the schema elements, whether they're required for the various RFA-1 events that Sarah mentioned earlier. And this also includes whether that field is mandatory conditional, if it's an optional field. If the field is conditional, we will actually list that condition on that element requirements conditions tab, so you will know exactly what's expected. And those are the same rules that are set up in that web form that Sarah mentioned earlier. A list of valid values and body part values tabs. Those tabs outline valid values for the various fields. And we have an error codes tab that lists the high-level error codes associated with errors that are returned. Just want to note that there may be specific error text returned for a schema element, just to give you a further explanation regarding the error. So if you did receive a rejection, we plan to be very clear on what that rejection is so you can fix it. But again, this spreadsheet, once it gets posted, will help you submit clean data right up front. Praveen's going to go over a actual sample XML file, but I'm going to set up what that scenario is, very similar to a scenario that Sarah used earlier. So you'll see on this screen here, we have a WCB case ID. It's properly formatted in the format of one of our case numbers. Contains the claimant's name, their date of injury, the reason that they want that RFA-1 to be filed is the claimant's not working and not receiving payments. Payment status is payments were suspended and should be reinstated. And there's also some proposed awards on the screen there. They are asking for continuing payments, are not asking for an expedited hearing. In addition, they are not asking for any additional proposed findings. You'll notice down there, in this case, you're required to reference a document ID. There's no attachment supporting with this RFA-1. So document ID number is from our eCase case folder. They're noting that it's a MENAIR that they're referencing, and it was received on July 1st, 2023. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Praveen, and again, he will walk you through an actual XML file.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Praveen Kurian. I'm the technical lead on the project. Out of the 3 submission methods that Tim Pasha mentioned earlier, the web app, API, and FTP, I'll be showing you an example of API submission. The example present in this presentation is to give you a heads up on the technical design of the API. All documents here, including the XML and XSD, are work in progress. Final product may be different from what is shared on the slides. So before you submit an API, you will need to register with Okta for an ny.gov ID or client ID. After that, you will also have to register with the board for the API submission. We are planning to publish all the necessary document on the board's website. The documents will include data requirement spreadsheet that Mike shared earlier, XML template for the RFA-1LC transaction, XSD schema definition, XML template for acknowledgement, XML examples, PDF sample of RFA-1LC, and other documents. So in this sample XML, the XML template has 2 main sections, the header node and the event details node. The header node contains the sender information. So the event node has 5 mandatory sections and 2 key search data elements. 2 key search data elements are WCB case ID and date of injury. If the data in the key search element does not match with the data in the board's database, we will reject the transaction without any further processing. There are 5 other mandatory nodes in the XML layout. The first one is the reason node. In the main reason node, we capture the reason specific data. As you can see in the example, all the reason code, the reason payment status, and the award periods, all that go inside the reasons node. So in the many of the data elements, we are expecting coded values instead of text, as in this example. For example, the reason code of CNW represents claimant is not working and not receiving payment. We are expecting the API consumers to make use of valid list of values that Mike mentioned earlier in the spreadsheet to look up the code and populate the data elements accordingly. So the next mandatory node is the supporting documents node. In the supporting document node, you can either reference an existing document from the case folder, or you can attach a PDF or JPEG document. The attachment must be included in the payload in a base64 string format. The attachment must be in the format in the PDF or JPEG format. We are not supporting any other format. The next mandatory node is the additional proposed findings. Additional proposed finding is a mandatory section for all submission. Information regarding the mandatory versus optional data elements will be included in the EDI documentation. The next mandatory node is the certification. Certification section is mandatory for most of the submission reason. You may not need to complete this section for some medical reasons. And then the final mandatory node is attestation, which is not shown here. And attestation is mandatory for all submissions. So XSD schema definition will be available on the board's website. Sender is expected to perform a self-validation of XML using the schema definition before sending the XML to the board. Keep in mind that XSD is only validating the structure, data integrity, and data type. Other element rules are performed during the API processing. For example, if you include a document ID or doc ID from the case folder as a supporting document for reference, we will look up the document ID and validate that to make sure that it's a right document ID, and it will be rejected if the document ID doesn't match with the case in the case folder. So after processing the transaction, the API will return the acknowledgement in an XML format, and the acknowledgement template as shown here will have the header section, which will contain the sender information, sender FIN, POI, submitted date, and it will have the event section where you will have the WCB case ID, transaction sequence number, the submission ID. Submission ID is the ID that board will generate, assign a unique ID for each transaction that was processed. And the submission status will tell you whether the transaction was accepted or rejected. If the transaction is accepted, then the acknowledgement will include a PDF embedded in there in the base 64 string format. If the transaction is rejected, it will contain the error as seen here. An error will contain the error code, the element, the data element that caused an error, and the text description. If there are multiple errors, it will include data element, name and the error code of each data element that resulted in an error. The error list, the full list of error codes are included in the EDI documentation that Mike shared earlier. So that concludes the example of XML API. Please let me know if you have any questions.
All right, I think Tim is going to cover our next steps, and then we will open the floor for questions.
Exactly. So before we get into the next steps, I'm sure there's going to be questions here, but as you can see from what the team just presented, we're basically creating, like I said earlier, a data specification that will contain complete scalability, flexibility, all XML based. And of course, with the XML base, you folks being able to do a schema validate, you folks getting full acknowledgements of every submission. If it's accepted, as Praveen said, a PDF is going to be generated of the notice itself, the submission of the RFA-1LC. It'll be the identical document that goes into the case folder. So we're giving you a copy of that as well. You're probably not familiar with our eClaims platform, but for the payer community, you're probably familiar if you work with your business team about FROIs and SHROIs that come to the board. Essentially, there is no national standard, as we were able to use the IIBC standard for those injury reporting forms. So hence, we have to create our own standard for all these types of events in the life of a claim that fall outside of that standard. So we've got good footing here in terms of, I think, the pillars of how we're building this. But of course, we always look for feedback from you folks, the consumers of this. And again, just repeating what I said earlier, I think depending upon the workflow at your individual customers and the volume of RFA-1LCs that you submit, you know, some folks may be just fine using eCase and submitting the RFA-1LC electronically through the web application. And some of you may choose to pursue these other two options that we just presented today. So I think we mentioned also we're going to be creating a web page with everything on that in terms of instructions. I think you heard today that if you're going to be using the API or you're going to be using the XML sFTP process, you've got to register, whether it be with Okta, whether it be with Akana. All of that will be step-by-step laid out for you, very clear instructions. We'll have a technical team on our end that'll walk you through this entire process. In addition to that, the data requirements table, the spreadsheet that Mike showed you, as soon as that is to a point where we can start sharing that, we will do that. As Mike said, that is really your Bible. That has everything in it that will communicate to anybody that wants to take advantage of the API or the XML file, how that schema has to be built. So that's going to be a critical document, and we recognize that. So we're taking painstaking steps to make sure that we thoroughly document. We are targeting to do some beta testing in the summer timeframe of this year. So any of you that are interested, Ali will give you the contact information here at the end in terms of where you can email us. But we're anxious to work with some of you if you'd like to be part of that beta testing. And I will just finally say that when we do get closer to the end of the year, and we're going to give folks plenty of advance notice when the actual implementation date of the RFA-1LC is, there will be a small formal test process for any of you that choose to use the API or the sFTP XML file, where you'll go through a test process. You'll demonstrate to us that you can successfully submit transactions to us. It won't be, you know, something that takes weeks. It'll be something that takes probably a day or two, but more to come on that. But there will be a formal testing process as well. So that's all I've got. Thank you.
I'll wrap up by saying thank you everyone very much for joining us today. It was a pleasure working with you, and I hope this has been a great experience for everyone. If you have any additional questions or feedback following this webinar, you can email the email on the screen, onboard@wcb.ny.gov. We greatly appreciate your time and efforts today, and I hope you have a great afternoon. We look forward to working with you further.